In the waning years of the Middle Ages, Europe stood at the edge of transformation. Kingdoms jostled for power, merchants dreamed of distant markets, and scholars pored over ancient texts as new ideas swept through crowded cities and quiet monasteries alike. Beyond the familiar boundaries of continent and sea, rumors of untold wealth and unknown peoples beckoned. It was an age marked by ambition and uncertainty, driven by the promise of spices from the east, gold from Africa, and lands yet uncharted. As sails unfurled on the Atlantic winds, a handful of European nations began to push outward, their ships carrying not only goods and guns, but languages, beliefs, and rivalries. The world would not remain unchanged. The story of European colonial expansion is one of curiosity and conquest, innovation and exploitation, a story that would redraw maps, reshape societies, and leave legacies still felt across the globe today. European colonial expansion did not arise in isolation. It was the result of centuries of shifting ambitions, hard-won technological progress, and intertwined motivations that drove people to look beyond the boundaries of their known world. In the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities, many just beginning to recover from the turmoil of previous centuries. Yet by the 15th century, a convergence of political, economic, religious, and technological factors set the stage for a dramatic outward thrust that would alter the course of global history. At the heart of this movement were three powerful motives: economic gain, religious mission, and the pursuit of glory. These were not separate ambitions. Instead, they overlapped and reinforced one another, pushing individuals and entire nations to risk the unknown. The lure of wealth was perhaps the strongest pull. European markets had long craved luxury goods from the East: porcelain, spices, silks, and tea. These items were precious not only for their rarity, but also for the prestige and profit they brought to those who could secure them. However, traditional overland trade routes were controlled by powerful states, particularly the Ottoman Empire, which acted as a gatekeeper between Europe and the riches of Asia. This control drove prices higher and limited access, fueling a desire among European powers to find alternative routes, preferably by sea, where they could avoid the tolls and restrictions imposed by land-based empires. Religion also played a central role in the European urge to expand. The memory of the Crusades and the centuries-long conflict of the Reconquista, culminating in Christian kingdoms reclaiming territory from Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula, left a cultural legacy of religious mission. The spread of Catholicism became intertwined with the ambitions of monarchs and explorers alike. The idea of bringing the Christian faith to new lands served both as a justification and a rallying cry for voyages of exploration. While the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation would become significant later, the initial phase of expansion was primarily driven by Catholic monarchies. The quest for glory was equally significant. In a Europe where social mobility was limited and reputation meant everything, the possibility of achieving personal or national greatness on the world stage became an irresistible allure. Monarchs sought to outdo their rivals, while explorers and adventurers aimed for immortality in the annals of history. This competitive spirit fueled the financing and planning of expeditions, as well as the fierce competition for newly discovered lands and trade routes. Underlying these motives was the economic doctrine of mercantilism, which dominated European thinking during this period. Mercantilism held that a nation's strength was measured by its stock of precious metals, and that colonies could serve as both sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. The pursuit of gold, both literal and figurative, became a defining feature of the age of exploration. Colonies were seen not only as sources of wealth, but as strategic outposts that could enhance a nation's power and prestige. Ambition alone, however, was not enough. The technological advances of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance were essential in turning European dreams into reality. Many of these breakthroughs were not purely European inventions, but rather the result of knowledge exchanged across Afro-Eurasia. The magnetic compass and compass rose, for example, were significant innovations that made long-distance sea travel more feasible and less perilous. European mariners also adopted the astrolabe, a navigational instrument with roots in earlier Islamic and Chinese civilizations, which allowed sailors to determine their latitude and plot more accurate courses across open water. The development of the mariner's astrolabe, in particular, was crucial in enabling voyages far from sight of land. Shipbuilding also underwent transformative advances. European shipwrights, especially in Portugal, designed new types of vessels that were both sturdy and maneuverable, capable of withstanding the rigors of the open ocean. The caravel, with its combination of triangular and square sails, could sail closer to the wind than earlier ships and was well suited for exploration along unknown coasts and across vast stretches of water. Improved maps and chart making, informed by information from scholars and sailors alike, gave explorers the confidence to venture farther than ever before. By the early 15th century, these forces began to come together in tangible ways. Portugal, under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, emerged as a leader in maritime exploration. In 1415, the Portuguese captured the North African port city of Ceuta, marking what many historians consider the beginning of the Age of Discovery. This conquest was not just a military victory. It served as a springboard for further ventures along the Atlantic coast of Africa and the establishment of colonies on Atlantic islands. Prince Henry, though not a navigator himself, sponsored expeditions, established navigation schools, and fostered the accumulation of geographic knowledge. By the mid-15th century, Portuguese ships had reached as far as Sierra Leone, systematically mapping the African coastline in their search for a sea route to Asia. The Portuguese were motivated by the same triad of goals seen across Europe: the pursuit of wealth, especially gold and lucrative trade goods, the spread of Christianity, and the hope of securing glory for themselves and their nation. Early Portuguese expeditions also initiated involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, which would become a dark and lasting legacy of European expansion. The Atlantic islands, such as Madeira and the Azores, became laboratories for colonial administration and economic exploitation, especially through sugar cultivation. While Portugal steadily explored the African coast, Spain looked westward. Backed by the Spanish crown, Christopher Columbus embarked on his famous voyage in 1492, seeking a direct route to Asia by sailing across the Atlantic. Instead, he encountered the Americas, opening a new chapter in the story of European expansion. Spain, driven by the desire for new territories, trade, and the spread of Christianity, quickly moved to claim and colonize vast areas of the New World. The expeditions of explorers like Hernando de Soto and Francisco Coronado, who ventured into the interior of the Americas, were motivated by the same blend of economic ambition, religious zeal, and personal glory that had driven earlier voyages. These early ventures by Portugal and Spain marked the first phase of what would become a global process, one that historians often describe as the earliest phase of globalization. The Atlantic world became a stage for unprecedented encounters between peoples, cultures, and economies. The Portuguese and Spanish models of exploration and colonization would soon be adopted and adapted by other European powers, leading to centuries of competition, conquest, and exchange. The Age of Exploration, which began in the early 15th century and extended into the modern era, was characterized by a relentless drive to find new trade routes, expand territorial claims, and establish settlements. Behind every expedition was a complex network of planning, financing, and support. Monarchs, bankers, and merchants all played vital roles in enabling these journeys, seeing in them opportunities for profit, prestige, and influence. The ports of Europe buzzed with activity as ships were outfitted, crews assembled, and cargoes loaded for the long and uncertain voyages ahead. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal maintained its lead in searching for a sea route to Asia, gradually accumulating a wealth of knowledge about navigation and geography. The systematic exploration of Africa's coast eventually led to the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope, opening the way to the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, Spain's encounters in the Americas set off waves of conquest and colonization that would transform entire continents. It is important to recognize that this expansion was not merely about discovery for its own sake. At its core, colonialism was a practice of political dominance and economic exploitation. European powers sought to control dependent areas and peoples, extracting resources to fuel their own economies and ambitions. This process, most commonly associated with the period from the 16th to the mid-20th centuries, began in earnest with the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta and the Spanish explorations that followed. The technological and organizational advances that enabled European exploration were matched by an ideology that justified domination and settlement. Colonies were imagined as extensions of the mother country, vital to the accumulation of wealth and the assertion of national prestige. Competition among European states was fierce, with each seeking to outmaneuver the others for strategic advantage. The Age of Exploration thus became an age of rivalry as well as discovery. As the early modern period unfolded, the scale and scope of European expansion grew. Innovations in navigation and shipbuilding continued to evolve, allowing explorers to venture farther afield. The Atlantic, once seen as a barrier, became a corridor connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Pacific, too, would become a target of exploration and conquest in later centuries, as European ambitions extended ever outward. The origins of European expansion, then, can be traced to a unique combination of economic, religious, and political motives, enabled by remarkable technological advances and a willingness to take unprecedented risks. The voyages of the Portuguese along Africa's coast and the Spanish across the Atlantic were only the beginning. Over the centuries that followed, the patterns they established of exploration, conquest, settlement, and exploitation would shape the world in ways that are still felt today. Yet, As historians acknowledge, there remain gaps in our understanding of every nuance and lived experience of the early explorers and those they encountered. The evidence we have, however, paints a vivid picture of a Europe on the brink of global transformation, propelled by dreams of gold, the call of God, and the pursuit of glory, all made possible by the ingenuity and determination of its people. By the dawn of the 16th century, the world stood on the brink of a transformation unlike any before. The empires of Europe, driven by ambition, competition, and a fervent sense of national identity, began to extend their power far beyond their own shores. What followed was an era of conquest and colonization, an age when the boundaries of continents blurred and the destinies of civilizations collided. The imperialist scramble for overseas colonies, which defined much of the 16th through 18th centuries, was fueled as much by the desire for national prestige as by the quest for wealth and resources. European rulers, attuned to shifting balances of power at home, saw in distant lands both the possibility of glory and the necessity of keeping pace with their rivals. Colonization was neither uniform nor uncontested. It unfolded differently across the globe, shaped by geography, the ambitions of European states, and, crucially, the responses of the peoples who already called these lands home. The Americas, Africa, and Asia each became stages for imperial expansion, but the methods and impacts of colonization varied. In the Americas, the Spanish and Portuguese empires claimed vast territories with astonishing speed. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, quite literally divided the world in two. Spain received dominion over lands to the west of an imaginary line, Portugal to the east. This division, negotiated between European powers with little regard for realities on the ground, set the stage for centuries of conquest and rivalry. In the wake of these agreements, Spanish conquistadors launched campaigns that toppled powerful indigenous empires and established new colonial states. The Spanish approach centered on extracting wealth, particularly silver and gold, and converting indigenous peoples to Christianity. Missions and encomiendas, systems of land and labor allocation, became tools of both spiritual conquest and material exploitation. The Portuguese, meanwhile, extended their influence along the coasts of Africa and into Brazil, combining trade, settlement, and the establishment of plantation economies driven by enslaved labor. Elsewhere in the Americas, other European powers soon followed. The English, French, and Dutch established their own colonies, each adopting distinct strategies. The English tended to found settlements with structured governments and economies rooted in agriculture and trade. In contrast, the French focused on establishing trading posts and forging alliances with indigenous nations, particularly in the fur-rich regions of North America. The Dutch, though less expansive, carved out profitable footholds through commerce and navigation. These colonial ventures were fraught with difficulty. Early settlements often struggled, beset by disease, hunger, and sometimes outright failure. Yet over time, patterns of settlement and governance took hold. By the early 18th century, the British, French, Spanish, and Portuguese empires were locked in fierce competition for global dominance, their fortunes intertwined with the success or failure of their overseas possessions. For the peoples already inhabiting the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the arrival of Europeans was nothing short of cataclysmic. Many indigenous nations' first encounters with Europeans were marked by violence, raiding, murder, and rape, setting a tone of mistrust and conflict. In North America, colonization was fundamentally an invasion of territory controlled by Native Americans. European settlements expanded into these lands, often without consent, leading to an almost constant state of negotiation, resistance, and, when diplomacy failed, war. Native Americans were not passive in this process. They employed a range of strategies, from military resistance and forging alliances to diplomacy and adaptation. Some nations aligned themselves with European powers, hoping to maintain influence or gain an advantage over rival groups, but the relationship was rarely equal or stable. European promises, often enshrined in treaties, were frequently broken, further eroding trust. The most devastating impact of European arrival was, perhaps, invisible at first. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through indigenous populations with horrifying speed. Lacking immunity to these foreign pathogens, entire communities were decimated. The demographic collapse that followed changed the balance of power, undermined traditional societies, and often made further resistance to European encroachment impossible. Alongside disease came new animals and plants, introduced through what historians call the Columbian Exchange. Horses, cattle, and pigs transformed landscapes and ways of life, while European land use practices disrupted indigenous economies and environments. Trade, too, became a double-edged sword, creating new alliances and opportunities, but also fueling conflict and dependency. The cultural disruptions were profound. Traditional practices and beliefs were undermined, sometimes by force, other times by the gradual erosion brought by contact and change. The African continent, though not fully colonized until the 19th century, was deeply entangled in the processes of European expansion. The demand for labor in the burgeoning plantations of the Americas fueled the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would reshape societies on both sides of the ocean. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, subjected to brutal conditions, and transported across the Atlantic, a journey that often ended in death or enslavement in the New World. This forced migration not only devastated African societies, disrupting families and traditional structures, but also became the economic backbone of many colonial ventures, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil. Within the Americas, the rise of plantation economies driven by crops like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton cemented the institution of slavery as central to colonial life. Plantations required vast amounts of labor, which European settlers were unwilling or unable to provide themselves. The exploitation of Africans as enslaved laborers became the grim solution, with consequences that still echo today. The brutal realities of plantation life, the violence of enslavement, and the legal systems designed to enforce racial hierarchies all took root during this period, shaping the social and economic landscapes of the colonies. European colonial rule did not manifest in a single form. Settler colonialism, where Europeans migrated in large numbers and displaced indigenous populations, often overlapped with exploitation colonialism, which focused more on extracting resources and labor while maintaining the dominance of a small European elite. These varieties sometimes blurred together, but both were underpinned by the desire to control land, people, and wealth. The imposition of colonial administration, whether through direct rule, alliances with local leaders, or the establishment of new institutions, was a constant feature of European expansion. The approaches of the major colonial powers reflected their priorities and circumstances. The English colonies, especially in North America, became known for their structured governments and, eventually, for systems of self-government and representative assemblies. These political innovations distinguished the English colonies from their French and Spanish counterparts. The French often relied on practical alliances with indigenous nations and focused on the fur trade and the establishment of trading posts rather than large-scale settlement. The Spanish approach remained centered on conversion and resource extraction, with the church and crown working together to impose their own vision of order. Notably, English settlers were often more militarily hostile toward native populations and focused heavily on producing cash crops like tobacco, while the French and English alike sought to make their colonies profitable through trade and adaptation. The consequences of these differing approaches were significant. In English North America, the growth of representative government laid the groundwork for later independence movements and a distinct colonial identity. In French and Spanish territories, the blending of European and indigenous cultures produced new societies, but also new hierarchies and points of tension. The Dutch, though less numerous, left an imprint through their commercial outposts and pragmatic approach to governance. The impacts of European colonization radiated outward, touching every aspect of life in the affected regions. The influx of new crops from the Americas, most notably the potato, would, in time, profoundly reshape European societies, supporting population growth and altering diets. At the same time, the forced movement of people, animals, and plants across continents set off environmental changes, many of which were destructive. Forests were cleared for plantations, native species were displaced, and new diseases threatened both humans and livestock. Trade networks spanning the Atlantic and, increasingly, the Indian and Pacific Oceans connected distant lands in webs of exchange and exploitation. The encounter between Europeans, the peoples of the Americas, and West Africans created what scholars often describe as a new world. This was not just a reference to the physical geography, but to the novel combinations of peoples, goods, and ideas that emerged from these interactions. Labor systems, ranging from indigenous enslavement to African chattel slavery, became central to colonial economies. Cultural exchanges, sometimes forced, sometimes voluntary, produced new languages, religions, and ways of life, even as older traditions were suppressed or destroyed. By the early 18th century, the European colonial project had reached a high water mark. The great powers of Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal competed not only for territory but for the prestige and wealth that came with empire. This competition, fueled by domestic nationalism and the imperative to maintain or enhance international standing, drove further exploration, warfare, and settlement. Colonization became a key arena in the contest for global dominance, with each power seeking to outdo the others in claiming land, establishing trade routes, and securing resources. The costs of this expansion were staggering. For indigenous peoples, the era brought genocide, epidemics, and the wholesale disruption of traditional societies. For Africans, it ushered in centuries of enslavement, displacement, and suffering. Even as colonialism introduced new institutions and infrastructure, the shadow of exploitation and violence loomed large. The extraction of resources, the overthrow of indigenous governments, and the imposition of alien systems of rule left enduring scars. At the same time, the age of empires set in motion patterns that would shape the modern world. The creation of vast interconnected markets and the movement of people and ideas spurred economic and cultural transformations. The very concept of race, with all its attendant hierarchies and prejudices, was reinforced and sharpened by the realities of colonial exploitation. The legacy of this period, its triumphs, tragedies, and unresolved tensions, would reverberate long after the guns of conquest fell silent, shaping the histories of nations and peoples across the globe. In the centuries that followed, the first wave of European empires would give way to a new phase of expansion, as industrialization, population growth, and shifting ideologies drove fresh incursions into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Yet, the foundations of this later imperialism were laid in the age of conquest and colonization, a testament to the enduring power of ambition, competition, and the human capacity for both creation and destruction. The legacy of European colonial expansion is complex, enduring, and often deeply paradoxical. As the age of empires faded and the world entered the modern era, the consequences of centuries of colonial rule became increasingly apparent in the economies of nations, in the patterns of political power, and in the very fabric of societies across continents. The story does not end with the raising of new flags over old capitals. Instead, the aftershocks of colonialism continue to reverberate, shaping the destinies of both former colonies and the European heartlands that once sought to dominate them. One of the most visible and lasting effects of colonialism appears in the economic fortunes of nations. Colonial expansion spurred economic development in parts of Europe, fueling the rise of new industries, urban centers, and financial institutions. The influx of resources, wealth, and new commodities from overseas transformed some European economies, turning them into engines of innovation and growth. Yet this prosperity was far from evenly shared. While some regions in Europe flourished, others lagged behind, their development hindered by shifting imperial priorities and the uneven benefits of global trade. This pattern of unequal growth laid the groundwork for persistent economic disparities within Europe, a legacy that continues to influence debates about regional inequality and development today. In lands subjected to colonial rule, the economic consequences were even more varied and profound. In some places, particularly where European settlement was extensive, colonialism brought a marked increase in average per capita income. Settler societies often gained from the introduction of new technologies, institutions, and forms of economic organization, laying the foundations for later prosperity. But this was far from universal. Across much of the colonized world, resource extraction, the imposition of new economic systems, and the disruption of traditional livelihoods led to enduring poverty and underdevelopment. Scholars believe the era of colonization significantly shaped the levels of economic development seen in countries today, helping explain why some nations have flourished while others still struggle to escape the shadow of deprivation. Perhaps nowhere is this legacy more starkly illustrated than in India. Before colonial rule, India accounted for a substantial share of the global economy, its cities alive with commerce and its artisans renowned for their skill. The arrival of European powers fundamentally altered the economic landscape. Colonial policies and practices redirected wealth and resources outward, enriching empires at the colony's expense. By the end of colonial rule, India's share of the world economy had dropped dramatically, leaving deep scars on the country's economic and social fabric. Similar stories unfolded elsewhere, as colonial powers restructured local economies to serve distant markets and imperial priorities, often undermining indigenous industries and setting back development for generations. Beyond economics, colonial expansion brought sweeping changes to the political and social organization of entire continents. The division of territories, often with little regard for existing boundaries, ethnic groups, or traditions, created multi-ethnic provinces and satellite states whose borders remain contentious even today. In the pursuit of administrative efficiency or imperial convenience, colonial rulers drew lines on maps that cut across communities, merged rivals, and divided kin. The result was a patchwork of states and provinces where conflicts simmered beneath the surface, fueled by uneven distributions of wealth and power and by systems of rule that were often profoundly undemocratic. These artificial borders and imposed institutions sowed the seeds for enduring cycles of violence, instability, and contestation. Nowhere were these dynamics more pronounced than in Africa. The legacies of European colonialism on that continent are visible not just in the lines on a map, but in the daily realities of its peoples. The creation of new political entities, the exploitation of natural resources, and the introduction of authoritarian governance combined to produce cycles of violence and poverty that persist to this day. The manipulation of ethnic and regional divisions, sometimes deliberate, sometimes born of ignorance or indifference, left a legacy of mistrust and fragmentation. Where wealth was extracted and concentrated in the hands of a few, inequality became entrenched. Where local traditions of governance were sidelined or suppressed, the development of stable, representative institutions was often stunted. These patterns, rooted in the colonial past, have made the pursuit of development and democracy a challenging and sometimes perilous journey for many African nations. The cultural consequences of colonial expansion were equally far-reaching. Languages, religions, and social norms were exported from Europe and imposed, sometimes gently, often forcefully, on colonized societies. Yet the exchange was not one way. Colonized peoples adapted, resisted, and reshaped these influences, creating new hybrid cultures in the process. The ideology of assimilation and association, which underpinned much colonial law, left a particularly deep imprint in places like France, where debates over national identity and the legacy of empire continue today. Even in contemporary Europe, doctrines and attitudes forged during colonial rule persist, shaping policies and public discourse around migration, citizenship, and cultural belonging. At the same time, the colonial experience profoundly affected Europe itself. European economies were transformed by the influx of new goods and resources, but the very idea of Europe, its sense of identity, mission, and destiny, was also shaped by the experience of empire. Intellectual and political movements within Europe were deeply influenced by encounters with the wider world, fueling debates about progress, civilization, and the meaning of freedom. The process of decolonization, in particular, forced Europeans to confront the contradictions within their own societies. As former colonies demanded and won independence, imperial powers were compelled to rethink their place in the world, their responsibilities to others, and their understanding of justice and equality. The road to decolonization was long and often tumultuous. At its core, decolonization was the process of undoing colonialism, a struggle for self-determination, for the right of peoples to govern themselves and shape their own destinies. The seeds of resistance were planted early, as colonized peoples found ways to push back against foreign domination through armed revolt, intellectual challenge, or the quiet preservation of cultural traditions. Over time, these movements grew in strength and sophistication. The aftermath of World War II marked a turning point. The collapse of colonial empires accelerated, and the right to self-determination became a central principle of the new international order. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, approximately 36 new states in Asia and Africa gained independence, a tidal wave of change that fundamentally reshaped the global landscape. The process was neither smooth nor uniform. Nationalist movements surged across continents, often meeting fierce resistance from colonial authorities. The dynamics of the Cold War added further complexity as rival superpowers vied for influence in the newly emerging states, offering support or opposition according to their own strategic interests. Decolonization transformed international relations, forcing old empires to relinquish power and compelling the world to confront new challenges of development, stability, and inclusion. The legacy of colonialism remained visible in almost every sphere, in the borders dividing nations, in the languages spoken in courts and classrooms, and in the institutions that governed daily life. For many new countries emerging from colonial rule, independence brought both promise and peril. The challenge of building stable governments, fostering economic development, and healing the wounds of the past was immense. The artificial borders and uneven structures left by departing colonial powers often complicated efforts to create national unity and effective administration. Cycles of poverty, conflict, and authoritarianism rooted in the colonial experience proved difficult to break. Yet the drive for self-determination proved remarkably resilient. Over time, new forms of solidarity and cooperation emerged as post-colonial nations sought to assert their place in a rapidly changing world. Meanwhile, in Europe, the legacy of colonialism continued to shape politics, culture, and society long after the formal empires had been dismantled. The persistence of colonial ideologies, the presence of immigrant communities from former colonies, and ongoing debates over responsibility and restitution all bear witness to the enduring impact of imperial rule. the doctrine of Eurafrica, for example, and the continued influence of assimilationist policies in France, reflect the complex ways in which colonial histories are woven into the fabric of contemporary European life. The legacies of colonial rule, then, are neither simple nor uniform. They are marked by profound inequalities and remarkable resilience. They are visible in the structures of global trade, in the languages and religions of nations, and in the very boundaries that define modern states. They echo in the struggles for justice and recognition undertaken by indigenous peoples and former colonies, and in the ongoing efforts to come to terms with the darker chapters of the past. As historians continue to explore the consequences of European colonial expansion, one thing is clear: the story is not just about the past. The seeds sown in the Age of Empire continue to shape the world we inhabit today, challenging us to confront the legacies of injustice, to recognize the costs and contributions of those who came before, and to imagine new possibilities for a future that is both more equitable and more inclusive. The process of reckoning with colonialism is ongoing, a testament to the enduring power of history to shape the destinies of nations and peoples across continents and generations.